So Robbie opened with the story about Frank approaching him with his interest in Heraclitus, and I'm kind of reminded that Heraclitus famously said, "One can't step in the same river twice." But sitting with all these faces around me, I feel like he's wrong. As Luyann and Robbie have already said, unlike so many people in our field of education technology, Frank so deeply understood that education and learning was a profoundly humane activity, and that the technology was subordinate to all that. So I'd actually decided that rather than talk about some of the project work we did at Dalton, which these folks are in better position to describe than I am anyway, I wanted to tell a story that's quite personal about Frank's impact on me and my family in the last few years. And in the story, I think, is a lot of what Frank represented as an educator, and that while the story has very little to do with technology, it has everything to do with what he stood for. But first, there's a line in Virgil that really two lines in Virgil that I feel are so emblematic of what Frank was to so many of us. The first is, your profession is not what brings home your paycheck. Your profession is what you were put on earth to do, with such passion and such intensity that it becomes spiritual and calling. And I think when Robbie said that Frank was a born teacher, that struck me as such an apt characterization of what Frank was about, that he couldn't be without teaching. Every relationship was about helping the people around him cultivate their sense of who they were and what they could aspire to. Another line in Virgil that struck me last night as I was preparing for this, endure the present and look ahead to something better. And Robbie talked about Frank being a radical, or I would say a revolutionary, but not one who was looking to tear down establishment, but one who had such a fundamental optimism about the future and about possibility. Frank was a builder and a maker, and not a destroyer, and frankly a launcher of so many people in this room. Which brings me to the story. And this will be hard for me to get through. A few years ago, Robin and Frank invited me and my wife and our children to Hanukkah at their house in Riverdale. And at the time, my kids, who are now 11 and 8.5, were maybe 8 and 5, or give or take. And we went up and had a lovely dinner, and Melissa and Scott were there, and it was just a really, really nice time together. Frank and I had not spent a ton of time together in recent years, and this was sort of the beginning of a phase of our lives where we reconnected and spent quite a bit of time together. And during that time, Frank had quite an impact on my children, which is why this is hard to describe. So we have dinner and light candles, and it's not lost on me that this whole event took place at a profoundly sacred tradition. And then sometime after dinner, the kids and Frank disappeared, and I didn't really know where they had gone, but Robin looked at me and said, "They're in the studio. They're in the studio." And which really meant that Frank had taken them downstairs to the basement to paint. And many of you have seen the various offices and studies and studios throughout the Frank Moretti life, and they all more or less looked the same. There were books everywhere, and canvases, and paintings, and paint, and goop, and they were not orderly environments. And so it was wonderful for my kids, of course. And so literally an hour or two goes by, and we've been talking. The grown-ups have been talking and talking about Melissa's time in Egypt and all sorts of amazing things. And finally, it becomes time to sort of check on the kids. So we walk downstairs, and it's like a whirlwind of activity. And the kids have painted 7 canvases, and Frank's got books open all over the place. And I just remember standing in the doorway watching all this. As Frank is asking Jonah, my, at that time, 5 or 6-year-old, questions about why he had composed his little 7-inch painting the way he had, and wouldn't it be interesting if he tried this, and Jonah explaining with incredible conviction why the bottom had to be this muddy color of green, and Frank saying, "That reminds me so much of one of my favorite Chagall paintings," and pulling out a book and opening it, and And I stood there thinking, he's doing it again. He's launching the next generation. And Frank's interest in the intellectual lives of children was so fundamentally sincere and genuine, and in that way so different from what goes on and what passes for education today so often. And he had such an incredible impact on my kids in such a small amount of time. So then, and I'll wind this up in a moment, but flash forward to a few years later, this past summer, when Frank's health declined very rapidly, and Luyann and I and others went up to visit. And my daughter, Olivia, who's now 11, somehow got wind, maybe overhearing conversation between me and my wife about Frank and Frank being sick. And she's a quite astute 11-year-old and figured out fairly swiftly that something serious was going on and very much wanted to go up and visit. And she seemed to grok that this would be the last time to see Frankie, which is what the kids called him. And I was not terribly enthusiastic about her coming. I thought it would be very, very difficult. And one thing led to another, and timing didn't work, and she went off to sleepaway camp that summer, and so did not get to see Frank. But when Andrea and I went up to visit Olivia at visiting weekend in the middle of the summer, I was hoping that she would not ask about Frank. But of course, the very first thing she said was, "How is Frankie? You can tell me the truth." And so we told her the truth, and which was that we had lost Frank in the last couple of weeks. And she cried for a while, but gathered herself. And then that evening, the campers put on this truly dreadful performance of Seussical the musical. But as I was sitting there watching Dr. Seuss be played out by a bunch of 11-year-olds in musical form, I was struck that there was a moment of poetry in that play that was also a very apt capturing of what Frank was about, which is, of course, when the great poet Dr. Seuss, through his vessel, Horton the elephant, says, "A person's a person, no matter how small." And I think Frank just so believed that that every child had such immense capability that was waiting to be drawn out of them, and had such a kind of, despite his huge personality and very strongly held beliefs, there was such a fundamental humility about Frank as a teacher that he subordinated himself to the student. He wasn't interested in being parroted, and when I think back on Frank, I always think back to that night at Robin and Frank's house in Riverdale, where that was so vivid to me in watching him interact with my children.